So, a interesting fact about me is that my favorite weapon is, or my favorite type of weaponry rather, is pole arms. I love spears, um, pikes, etc. The whole pole arm. There's a lot of variations of pole arms, and with different uses and strengths and weaknesses. But that's always been my favorite, you know, like weaponry and like, for instance, my favorite battle formation is the phalanx, or more specifically, the Macedonian phalanx, utilized by Alexander the Great and his father Philip of Macedon. And there's just something so cool about just like how powerful pikes slash spear slash pole arms are. And I think like the biggest leap is after the fall of the Diadochi, right, to the Romans. The polearm slash pike kind of went out of style until like the rise of the Swiss, who brought it back, and everyone saw just how OP pikes are. It's like humanity remembered, oh yeah, pikes are cool. And then eventually then you have the Spanish Terrico, like, I forgot the last part, but point is, they combine pikes with guns, and, I just think that when you look at history, I think the pike, slash polearm is definitely so OP, and it managed to turn people who weren't even the best trained, like, I think, like, the Swiss pikemen weren't as well trained as a medieval knight, but, like, they would dominate, because it's like you put a group of guys together, give them long, pointy sticks, and they just charge, and it just instantly mow down anyone. It's like the pike, I felt like, really came out on top at the end as the ultimate infantry weapon when everyone, utilized in a group, obviously, not just individual. And, eventually guns kind of withered it out because we developed things, but I felt like at the end, yeah, the pike is OP. It's my favorite type of weaponry. And, like, a lot of people, like, I feel like in, like, literature, right, in, like, video games and whatnot, it's always, there's a lot of emphasis on the sword. The sword is, like, the ultimate weapon, the most popular. There's been countless tropes of magical swords. Sword, all that. But I've always been like, no, I think, like, polearms are cooler. Even in, like, video games like Dark Souls and, like, Elden Ring, I just always want to use, like, a frickin', spear or, like, whatnot. It's just, I don't know, like, I'm fanboying, I'm gushing, I know, but, like, I just find it so cool. Just something about just a group of guys getting together and just pointing their giant sticks at people and just mowing them down, just, I don't know. Like I said, the pike is slash polearm is my favorite weapon, and my favorite battle formations, like the Macedonian phalanx and the Swiss pikemen, are they're my favorite in terms of like battle formation slash types of soldiers, because there's just something so cool about it. Can you guys tell I'm really a big fan of this? I feel very passionately about this, and yeah, I got recommended this video, and it's about, 7 pike formations that dominated the battlefields of their time. And we're gonna be watching this. This might be one of my, if not my most favorite video we've ever seen, just because it seems like it's gonna have everything I've ever wanted. So I'm gonna stop, gushing about the pike, and we're just gonna learning more about it. We're gonna learn more about it. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, this YouTuber is called SandRhoman History. I've never seen any of his videos. This is the first time we're watching this guy, both on and off camera. Like, I've never watched him even off camera. So, yeah, I think we should just get to it and see what SandRhoman History can offer. So, with that said, let's get to it, shall we? Let's watch 7 pike formations that dominated the battlefields of their time.
Formations dominated the battlefields of the world. From the Macedonian phalanx, which was one pillar of Alexander the Great's success, to the Schiltron as a decisive factor in the Scottish struggle for independence, to the Spanish Tercio, the war machine helping the Habsburgs to control Europe. These formations shaped the warfare of their time decisively. In this video, we will look at some hand-picked examples, work out some of these formations' most central characteristics, and look at several of their most famous battles as well. For the sake of brevity and entertainment, we will prioritize interesting aspects over in-depth analysis. More detailed info about each formation can be found by clicking on the links in the top right corner of the screen. So let's dive straight in. The first formation to talk about is obviously the ancient Greek phalanx. It is best known for the importance.
Yeah, so obviously there are two, kind of when talking about the ancient Greeks, there are two types of phalanxes. There's obviously the popular Macedonian phalanx, as I mentioned earlier, utilized by Alexander and his father Philip, and then there's the original Greek hoplite phalanx, which, utilized shorter spears and whatnot. Obviously, we're no stranger to the Macedonian phalanx. Like I said, it's my favorite battle formation, and the thing about it is, I mentioned in the past that, yeah, it dominated the world at its time before the Roman legion essentially kicked it out, and pikes kind of weren't as utilized ever, until much later, when the pike, had a resurgence, because everyone realized just how OP it actually is. But the thing about the Macedonian phalanx, it was a part of the combined arms thing of Alexander. Like, Alexander didn't just use the phalanx, he also had a bunch of other troops, of archers, the companion cavalry, great cavalry, a lot of supporting infantry / range units, from archers, slingers. There's a lot to it. There's like a combined arms thing with Alexander, though, obviously the phalanx was one of the important aspects. The thing is about the Macedonian phalanx is that it required a lot of conditions to be met in order to be effective. A well-placed phalanx with proper ground, rightly protected wings, etc., was almost impenetrable, to an opposing army going up against it, like an unbreakable wall of steel and pike. But the thing is, again, the conditions to be met for that to be utilized to its full potential, were vast, in a sense that you needed right terrain. you needed proper terrain in order for the phalanx to be utilized. Like, rough, uneven terrain would disrupt its cohesion and the discipline of the phalanx, creating gaps, and it was a weakness. Case in point, Pyrrhus of Epirus versus Rome. The Romans began luring Pyrrhus into battlefields of their choosing because they realized the phalanx can be disrupted on uneven ground. In terms also with that, there's also basically, if you can get around it, or like if its sides weren't properly, protected, or its rear, essentially if you hit it, it completely breaks, It was rigid, obviously. It was very rigid and inflexible compared to like the Legion. The Legion could essentially, that's one of the big reasons people will cite why the Roman Legion eventually usurped the Macedonian phalanx as the top, fighting style, because the phalanx was very rigid, and if attacked from the back, essentially completely it's wiped out. Like with the various Roman / Macedonian wars, the Romans found ways to get behind the phalanx, and once they did, or around its flanks, instant win for the Romans. So yeah, like I said, there are various conditions that it needed to be, and lack of flexibility, needing proper support, and needing good terrain. So I mean, I love it. Like I said, it's my favorite thing. Just look at that. It just looks so cool. And the fact people would just charge right into that crap and it would just mow things down. Though the way Alexander used the phalanx, you know, obviously his use of the phalanx was the peak use of it, you know, and all the successors, Diadokis, I don't think ever used it as well as he did, but, you know, essentially hammer and anvil tactics. The phalanx was more to keep, you know, the enemy in place while the cavalry contingent did the work, and then, you know, the hammer and the anvil from Alexander. So, yeah, again, it's very, in a sense, not the main offensive unit, you know what I mean? At least in the way that it was utilized there. And, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get everything out. By the way, it's super late right here, so forgive me if I'm rambling on. But I really do love this. And, yeah, let's get back to watching the video.
Important role it played during the conquest of the Macedonian king Alexander the Great. As one of the pillars of his military success, the phalanx played a decisive role in several battles, such as Chaironea, Granicus, and Gaugamela. At Gaugamela, in 331 BC, Alexander faced a Persian army superior in numbers under Darius III. The Macedonians defeated the Persians by luring most of the cavalry on the Persian left flank.
Yeah, the Battle of Gaugamela. It really was. Alexander really went left, leading, you know, again, a lot of the units to come here. And then Alexander just manages to almost book it and try to kill Darius himself. That's the funniest thing. But also Parmenion, MVP of a lot of the big battles. Parmenion was always holding the left and holding it down while everything else was happening. So, you know, definitely.
To decide where they managed to defeat them. This opened up a gap in the center, which the phalanges of the first line and Alexander's cavalry could exploit to decisively win the battle. The Battle of Gaugamela is considered the final blow to the Achaemenid Empire, which was then completely conquered by Alexander. The origin of the phalanx, however, begins about 300 years earlier. Beginning in
Yeah, I've heard that that one of the earliest uses of the phalanx, I'm trying not to look at all the new painting dudes in front of me, but, you know, I think it was in the First Empire, which was called the Akkadian Empire? Wait. Sorry, I got that wrong, but, yeah, the first earliest use of the phalanx, often attributed to the Sumerians. So it wasn't even a sort of Greek thing. Like, obviously the phalanx is associated primarily with the Greeks, you know, and it really was their main fighting way until, you know, eventually the Romans took over. But, you know, yeah, eventually the phalanx is really old. One of the oldest, you know, fighting formations in history, and I've heard that, like, it was attributed with the Sumerians, kind of away from the Greeks, you know, in terms of origin. Alright, hopefully we zone out of this.
In the 7th century BC, it became the standard formation for armies throughout Greece. The phalanx consisted of heavily armed foot soldiers, so-called hoplites. Every soldier had to bring his own weapons and armor. The hoplites were arranged in close ranks so that they formed a shield wall, with the shield of every man covering the right side of the one.
I don't think this is correct, but I had heard that some of the ways well, there's an idea. I don't know if I fully believe it. Like I said, I'm gonna have to look into more of the Greek hoplite pre-Macedonian thing, but a lot of it was like pushing with their shields, kind of almost like a tug of war, you know. Well, tug of war is probably not the way I'd use it, but, you know, essentially a lot of you know, there would be a sort of tug of war with people and their shields pushing each other, and a lot of soldiers mainly died in history due to routing. I think routing when an enemy force routed is where the majority of soldiers would die. And I had heard that like sometimes the Greeks would essentially push each other until one side eventually gave in and routed, kind of with their thing. I don't think that's fully correct. I only had heard that. Again, I'm gonna have to look into that. I'm not claiming I know that, I just heard that, you know what I mean. But though I do believe I am correct about most casualties lied in the routing,
Standing next to him. Besides the shield, they carried spears, and secondary weapons such as daggers and swords. Usually, the phalanx was 8 rows deep, while the width depended on the overall number of men. In battle, the phalanges marched towards the enemy and tried to push them away. The goal was to disrupt their battle order to gain a significant advantage. This is best shown by the fact that an army usually suffered most losses once the formation was broken up and the men turned to flight.
Like I said, most of the casualties happened in the rout, and I had heard that, so I was kind of right in what I've heard. That essentially they would push each other. It's almost like almost sportsmanship-like, in a sense. Like, okay, who's just the stronger? Let's push until one side could push far enough to, like, disrupt the entire formation. So it's kind of like this weird wrestling matter of time. It's very sportsman-like, you know what I mean? Like, the way they did it. And as we saw here, yeah, and they would essentially push until one side gave complete way, until everything fell apart, and then it would cause a rout in which most would die. Most of the casualties would be in the retreat/rout. So, yeah.
Naturally, every man tried to get his uncovered right flank behind the shield of his neighbor. Thus, the formation had a tendency to spin to the right. If two phalanges fought, they could even rotate counterclockwise. This was even more of a problem because of the distribution of elite fighters within the formation. Traditionally, the most veteran men were at the right wing. This meant that each right wing fought the enemy's weak left wing. Whoever won on the right wing first usually ended up winning the battle.
Again, it's very much like a kind of a time limit, right? Okay, who can move quicker to break the left? You know what I mean? Like I said, it's like this force of will push between the two sides, and it's like, really you're on the clock. Like, one side's gonna have to go down. Like I said, like, the way the Greeks did it, it comes across like, I keep using the word sportsmanship-like, but like, that's what I mean. It comes across like that. In a way, I don't usually associate sports with war, in a sense, but, like, the way the Greeks do it, like, the original phalanx, then, yeah, it kind of comes across like that. A test of strength until one side gives in, and, yeah, again, it's, like, the complete, it's like a time limit. Which side can push the weaker side first, and then, yeah, so...
This problem of the early Greek phalanx formation was solved by the generals of Thebes in the 5th and 4th century BC.
Thebes, yeah, Thebes is most famous for basically dethroning Sparta, and their sacred band. They defeated the Spartans at the height of their influence/power over Greece, and they used their sacred band. And essentially, basically overthrew Sparta until eventually Macedon showed up and then took down Thebes, and everyone else, so, yeah.
First, the right wing was deepened to 25 ranks in order to defeat the enemy's weaker side more quickly. Then, in the Battle of Leuctra, the famous general Epaminondas arrayed his troops in the so-called oblique order. This is considered one of the most important tactical developments. He inverted the traditional order by placing his best man on the left wing and deepening it to 50 ranks. Thus, when the Thebans met the Spartans on the field of Leuctra, the elites of the two armies clashed. Epaminondas' plan worked out. His left wing won the clash, while his weaker center and right wing stayed back, which is the reason this order is called oblique. The next reform was implemented by the Macedonian king Philip II.
Yeah, it's funny just how much of the phalanx formation was, alright, let's make our spears longer and make our lines deeper. like, I kind of joked around that, like, if the Romans had never shown up and the phalanx had remained the main fighting, formation in history, then we would have seen, like, get ridiculously, like, 100-foot spears needing 3 to 4 men to carry it, and lines deep, like 100 men deep, like just comically large. It just keeps evolving, and the spears keep getting longer, the lines keep getting deeper. Obviously that's a joke, but like I like to think, because a lot of the Greek evolution of the phalanx is really that, spears getting longer and lines kind of getting deeper. So yeah, and Philip, the revolutionary mind that he was, created the sarissa, like a 20-foot spear requiring 2 hands to hold. Soldiers would essentially have their shield tied around, like, their neck to their shoulder. Men would stand close together. The shields weren't too big because it would restrict movement and speed. So, the Macedonian soldiers had to stand close so their shields would kind of protect. I believe the shield was on their left. So, in case something hit you, it would hit there, hopefully. And yeah, they would need both hands to carry the sarissa. And yeah, I think the lines were, 16 deep? Like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 13. Yeah, I was correct on that. 16 men deep, and yeah, overall, they just started mowing down all their enemies with this,
He equipped his men with the famous sarissa, a pike of 5 meters and a light shield. The Macedonian phalanx was 16 rows deep and arranged in a way that the sarissas of the 2nd to the 5th row had their points all in front of the first line.
Yeah, like, as you look, the first few lines pointed straight out, and then the subsequent lines, it gets higher and higher. I'd heard that a lot of it was to protect from projectiles flying over, and also it could be used to kind of screen what's going on behind them, So those are some explanations that I've heard regarding that. And again, I would have killed to see this in action. We're a few thousand years removed from the heyday of the Macedonian phalanx. But man, it would have been cool to see this baby in action. Like, if I could go back in time, I would want to see, like, this like being used. It just looks so cool to me. It's my favorite battle formation in all of history. That's why I'm kind of salty that I love Rome, but I am salty when they defeated the Greeks / Diadochi, only because the phalanx basically was retired, and so were the pikes for a lot of areas in human history,
Further to the back, held their weapons vertically, and increased the pushing power of the formation. In the early days, the phalanx was almost exclusively made up by Greek Macedonian fighters, but after the 3rd century BC, the Macedonian rulers increasingly relied on mercenaries. According to the historian Leonhard Burckhardt, the Macedonian phalanx had 2 crucial weaknesses. Firstly, it struggled on uneven terrain, and secondly, the formation was not suited for close-up melee fights. The long weapons that made the formation strong early on in a fight were too unwieldy in a long and extended melee battle.
Yeah. The thing is, though, obviously, if you utilize a pike properly, your enemy won't get close to you. That's like the whole point, right? You don't want them getting close to you when you're using a pike. It's not like a hand-to-hand, sword-to-sword fight. It's meant to keep the enemy at arm's distance, and that's kind of the thing with how weaponry evolved. The longer the reach of the weapon, the better, and so yeah.
And the longer a battle took, the likelier it became that the formation would be disrupted. These weaknesses became
Yeah, again, it did require a lot of discipline. Like, you needed to essentially be in sync with the people around you, and if morale's falling and the pressure's getting too high, and if you're sustaining enough losses, disruption between that thing. So again, discipline's the whole point of the phalanx, right? You need a lot of discipline. You need your troops to be as disciplined and their nerves to be as steel as possible for if it's gonna work, you know?
Became obvious in the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC, when the Macedonian phalanges under King Perseus met the Roman army under the experienced commander Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Both armies chose a traditional array, with the phalanges and legions respectively in the center, additional infantry beside them, and cavalry on the wings. The battle began in the afternoon. At first, the Romans had difficulties to deal with the long sarissas of their enemies, and the Macedonians advanced towards the Roman camp, which is situated at the foothills of Mount Olocrus. When the phalanges entered the uneven terrain, they lost cohesion and gaps opened in their lines. Paulus immediately reacted, divided his troops, and ordered them into these cracks.
Again, you see the flexibility and mobility of the legion. You know, I've seen so many, and videos regarding the legion versus the phalanx and read up a lot about it. And always a big thing, a common trend that'll be mentioned is flexibility, adaptability, maneuverability in terms of why the legion overcame. And yeah, again, it goes to show you the phalanx well placed on good terrain, basically unpenetrable, a solid wall that just pushes the enemy back. But the moment it's disrupted, its weakness shows, right? And the Romans could, with their legion, could just go and move about that. So again, yeah.
In close combat, the Roman legionaries, specialized in close-up melee fighting, quickly gained the upper hand. When the Roman cavalry on the right wing defeated the weaker Macedonian cavalry and turned towards the infantry, organized resistance became impossible. Many Macedonians were butchered where they stood.
Yeah, they couldn't turn back, when they got jumped from behind, so essentially it was GG from there, right? It goes that battle perfectly captures why the phalanx was bested by the legion, So like I said, what I'm mainly aware of is the phalanx, the Swiss Pike Square, and the Landsknecht, Pike Square, and finally the Spanish Turquio. Those are the only ones that I'm aware of. So this is a new one. The Scottish I know nothing about. And what's coming after? The Dutch, Swedish. Oh, I do know about the Swedish brigade that from the Great Northern War when we looked at those videos and how the Swedish became so powerful thanks to their hand-to-hand close combat. Well, not hand-to-hand, but their close combat was great. They utilized pikes. So I do know a bit about that. So now we're in uncharted territory. I don't know crap about the Scottish. But yeah.
Unlike the Romans, who didn't put a lot of emphasis on long spears, other armies continued to rely on spear-armed troops. But for the next couple of centuries, it seems that, generally speaking, more linear formations were used, for example, shield walls. Let's fast forward to 13th century Scotland, where we find the next subject of study, the schiltron. This massed infantry formation is first mentioned in accounts about the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, but it is very well possible that it was in use much earlier. The schiltron could either be rectangular or circular. The latter was the case at Falkirk. There, the Scottish formed 4 circles, and even reinforced them by plugging additional stakes into the ground. The outer rows then knelt with their pikes pointed towards the enemy, while the following rows placed them above their comrades. Deployed in this hedgehog-like way, the schiltron was extremely immobile and essentially defensive, which proved fatal at Falkirk. After the Scottish cavalry had retreated, the 4 circular schiltrons were significantly weakened by English archers and slingers, and then overrun by cavalry. The circular schiltron's defensive capabilities should not be underestimated. However, it is not as useful as a tunnel, such as the one a VPN establishes to protect your privacy in particular, in contrast to circular schiltrons, which were mainly used defensively. Rectangular schiltrons could also serve offensive purposes. There are only few descriptions of the formation, but 2 accounts give us an idea of how it might have looked like. The Vita Edvardi Secundi informs us that the men had axes as side weapons and spears as primary weapons, with their spears pointed outwards. They advanced like a hedgehog, or as the chronicler has it, like a phalanx. John of Krokelov adds that they used other weapons and shields as well. This description is suspiciously close to a Greek phalanx, and some historians actually argued that the Scots indeed had the ancient phalanx in mind when arraying their men in the battles of the Wars of the Scottish Independence. But due to the lack of sources, this is impossible to prove. One example for the schiltron's successful use is the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. On the second day of the battle, when the major clash was taking place, the Scottish schiltrons awaited the attacking English behind the river Bannock. When the English cavalry attacked, it failed to break the formations. The Scots then advanced and pushed the horsemen back towards the English infantry, still trying to cross the Bannock. This inevitably caused chaos. Many Englishmen were trampled to death or drowned in the river. The Battle of Bannockburn is deemed one of the worst defeats an English army has ever suffered. Similar infantry formations were also used elsewhere, for example by the Flemish, Welsh, and Portuguese. Most famously, however.
Okay, he's about to get to the Swiss. I'm telling you, like, it's cool because, you know, the Macedonian phalanx became the ultimate, you know, battle formation. The Romans got rid of it, but then many centuries past the Romans, you know, it's like the pike just made a comeback. Like, the Romans retired, you know, the pike. Obviously, spears were used throughout the world, like, but you know what I'm talking about, like, as kind of like this main force in the world. But it's like, it just came back. Like, the pike had a resurgence around the middle, you know, the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. It's like, it just came back. People, like, remembered, hey, pikes are OP, you know, let's use them again. And then it just came back, like, you know, that's why I really love this. Like, again, my favorite weapon with some of my favorite formations just came back from the dead, essentially, and humanity remembered. Like, especially with the Swiss. Like, the Swiss basically showed, okay, yeah, the pikes are back, guys, and they're OP. They came back to dominate battles, you know? Like I said, I love Rome, but yeah, I'll admit that their rise and them essentially kind of getting rid of the pike was my least favorite part about the Romans' rise to power and triumph over the Greeks. That's the only part. Everything else I love Rome for. Big Rome guy here, you know, on this channel, you know. For those of you who've been around, you know I love Rome. For those of you who are new, you know, I really do love Rome. We've seen so many Rome videos on this channel. But, yeah, like I said, I'm happy. The pike came back from the dead, man. It's like, humanity realized it should have never completely gone out of style. It just evolved, in a sense. You know what I mean? Like, almost like, I feel like with the Swiss and so on, it feels like the phalanx did come back, but, like, it evolved. You know what I mean? Like, you know, essentially, like, the spiritual successors of the Macedonian phalanx with these pikes from later on, like with the Swiss. And I think what's cool about the Swiss square formations is just how not only is it just cool, like I said, Porcupine is the most apt word to use regarding that. Like, a giant porcupine, essentially. And the Swiss, essentially came to dominate battles. Like, in the medieval ages, you think of, like, knights, right? Knights on horseback. And for a while, that is what dominated battlefields. But then the Swiss, a lot of it I heard was made up of, like, peasants and, like, farmers. Like, you just give a bunch of, like, people not as trained as a medieval knight would be, just get them together with a bunch of pikes, pointy sticks, and then they went on to essentially humble the knights, dominate battlefields, dominate and defeat knights, mounted knights. The Swiss essentially countered the mounted knight and went on to become the dominant force until, guns and, like, artillery came into the picture to kind of dethrone them. But again, I think if guns had never come around, the pike might have just forever remained the ultimate battle formation. Like, imagine a world where guns don't exist. Like, I feel like the pike would have forever remained, the most OP weapon, At least I like to believe that. I wish I could go into an alternate reality and see that, because I just wish the pike was back. It's retired now, again, because guns, and, like, the guns retired this weapon. But I like to think it would have still been around and prevalent had, guns not had risen, So yeah, about the Swiss, I've heard that with their square formations, what made them unique is that they could be not only defensive, but offensive. They could run right at you with their frickin' pikes, and then essentially mow you down, just charge at you and just break you. Like, probably a huge improvement over the Macedonian phalanx, and the Swiss could just do it mainly by themselves. I don't even think they even had much support. Like, with the Macedonian phalanx, you needed the cavalry, you needed all kinds of units around it. Not to say the Swiss didn't, but I've also heard of times where the Swiss had nothing but their square pike formation, and they still went on to dominate. Like, it really is just amazing to see it come back. How it just all resurged and essentially overthrew the mounted knight. And again, like, one Swiss pikeman is nowhere near as trained or as deadly as a medieval knight. Medieval knights were trained from, like what, teenagehood or childhood, all the way into their adulthood, to not only wear their plate armor, but to basically be, like, tanks, like human tanks on the battlefield. And it's like, the Swiss just got a bunch of, like, people not as trained. I had heard, like, peasants slash farmers, and again, if you just put them all together with freaking pikes, they went on to dominate against the knights. So it's amazing. Kind of like, it goes to show you, like, with the phalanx, he mentioned earlier how the original Macedonian phalanxes were mainly just Macedonians. Philip recruited, like, shepherds and craftsmen, basically, like, common people from Macedon, and he made them into the most elite fighting force in the world, with just the phalanx and the sarissa. So it goes to show you, like, just the strength of the pike. One pike by itself is useless, but many pikes with many people moving together as one dominates battlefields against everyone else. Gosh, I don't think I've ever been this passionate in any video we've ever watched on this channel ever. I don't think I've ever talked this much. Alright, let's get to this. I'm sorry, guys. I'm having so much fun talking about this. I just really love this.
The Swiss picked up on this idea. All these medieval formations had a common purpose: coping with cavalry. The Swiss reached perfection at this art. The Swiss pike square, also known as Gewalthaufen, literally crowd of force, is sometimes directly compared to the ancient Greek phalanx. However, there are some significant differences. First off, it was a mixed formation. In contrast to the Greek phalanges, most of the fighters were equipped with shorter weapons, namely halberds, swords or axes, and the like. Only the outer rows consisted of heavily armed men with pikes. Secondly, phalanges could be arrayed as widely as needed. That is, their front could be stretched according to the terrain and available fighters. The Gewalthaufen, in contrast, almost always had the same number of ranks as rows. An army was in most cases subdivided into vanguard, main body and rear guard, which allowed for completely different tactical maneuvers. Around the 1420s, the Swiss adopted longer pikes in greater mass. About a quarter of the overall strength were long pikes. This made the formation dauntingly effective against cavalry. When a cavalry charge was incoming, the pikemen, whether Scottish, Swiss or Landsknechts, aimed at the horses. Quote,
"Winter has arrived in Gaza, the nights are cold, and thousands of troops.
The horseman is lost."
Again, like, the medieval knight was overthrown by the pike, you know? And it's just insane. Like I said, I wish I could have seen this in action too. Like, this seems so awesome, you know?
But a wall of pikes was also a terrifying prospect for infantry formations. On the offensive, the Swiss pike square was capable of steamrolling charges. After the clash, the pikemen would step aside so that the more agile men with shorter weapons in the center could storm out and kill the enemy. Though extraordinarily effective, the Gewalthaufen was not invincible. In the Battle of Bicocca in 1522, for example, the Swiss charged an army.
Yeah, again, we saw a lot of this with the Italian Wars series by Kings and Generals we reacted to a while back. And again, like, artillery, the evolution of guns, you know, and firearms essentially undid, you know, the Swiss supremacy, right? It goes to show you just like guns just started to rise, firearms, and just kind of overthrew traditional just pikes, you know? So, I remember this. They're charging, but they're getting mowed down by the artillery. By the time they reach the enemy, they're pushed back.
Army of Spanish arquebusiers and Landsknechts, who had dug in behind a sunken road and rampart. When they came within reach, the Spanish shot inflicted significant losses on the Swiss. After some desperate attempts, some of the Swiss made it up the rampart, only to meet the Landsknechts. The Swiss were nearly annihilated and were forced to retreat.
Yeah, the Landsknechts, when we covered the 30 Years' War, were essentially the rivals of the Swiss. I believe they were German in origin, and I'd heard they were, you know, in terms of, like, equipment, there was a lot more money thrown at them, right? They used a lot more money in their gear. They also were known to wear, like, these more colorful outfits, you know, with patterns and whatnot, and they were essentially, like, the rival of the Swiss. And, like, fighting together, I had commented it must have been like two porcupines having sex, pike on pike battle when the enemy is using pikes as well. It just, can you imagine just how disorienting that would be? Just giant pikes everywhere, men poking, just like everywhere you look, just like, I feel like it would be so disorienting and like a complete cluster F to watch and be a part of it in like pike on pike battles, you know? Yeah.
Let's switch perspective. The Landsknechts had adopted the Swiss pike squares just before 1500 and improved it significantly. Now, the men with pikes made up more than 50% of a pike square, and the square itself was stratified. Rows of pikemen alternated with melee fighters carrying two-handers and short polearms. In comparison to the Swiss, the Landsknechts pikemen themselves held their weapons closer to the end, so that the points of 5 or 6 men standing behind each other could all be placed in front of the first man. In addition, as Reinhard Baumann, an acknowledged expert on the Landsknechts, notes, quote, Frundsberg, a famous Landsknechts leader, apparently recognized the signs of the times. The future belonged to firearms, end quote. Not only did he recognize this, but he also put it into practice, and consequently increased the number of firearms in his units. The first rank of a Landsknechts regiment usually consisted of Doppelsöldner armed with pikes. The term Doppelsöldner, which translates to double mercenary, refers to a mercenary who gets double pay. These were usually heavily armored veterans, or fighters who bore more risk because they fought in the so-called verlorener Haufen, which in English is usually referred to as forlorn hope. This was a small band of men fighting under a blood-red flag. The forlorn hope was basically a death squad, consisting of criminals, Landsknechts chosen by lot, and volunteers, which served to breach the enemy lines. From about 1522 onward, this was mainly done by the relatively loosely operating shot, which tried to shoot gaps into the enemy formation to create an opportunity for the infantry to attack. Not their most famous, but a very fitting example is the Battle of Cerignola in 1503. There, the Landsknechts and about 1,000 Spanish arquebusiers defeated a force of 9,000 Swiss pikemen and French heavy cavalry. When the Swiss approached the Spanish position, they were first weakened by the arquebusiers, and then dealt the final blow by the Landsknechts. Cerignola is considered the first battle won with gunpowder in Europe, and with this, we are entering the age of pike and shot warfare.
Yeah, also, I was gonna say it, but he said it for me, pike and shot. The next evolution, you know, what's pikes are OP, guys. Let's combine them with guns now, essentially is what people said, right? And then, like, using guns / pike. And I you know, obviously the Spanish dominated the battlefields of their time with their Turquillo. I'm not saying that correctly, I know. But, you know, essentially, yeah. Essentially guns got brought in, but eventually as guns developed, you know.
One of the most famous pike and shot formations was the Spanish Tercio. It dominated the battlefields of Europe up to the 30 Years' War. The Tercio was an answer to a puzzle of warfare. Pikemen on their own were vulnerable to shot units, while arquebusiers alone could be ran over by cavalry very easily. The solution was a symbiosis of both, so that the arquebusiers could shoot at an enemy infantry formation and step back into the cover of the pikemen if a cavalry charge was expected. Thus, the idea of pike and shot was born. The Spanish were the first to put this into practice. They soon created a military Goliath described as, quote, exemplary for an era of military history, end quote, by the expert of early modern history Michael Sikora. Created in 1534, the Tercio consisted of 10 companies, 8 of which were composed of 200 pikemen, 100 arquebusiers, and 20 musketeers. 2 companies were composed of exclusively shot units. So, in an ideal scenario, a Tercio was about 2,500 to 3,000 men strong. In battle, the formation had a corps of about 2,000 melee fighters. The gunmen were arranged on either side of them in so-called garrisons, and 4 additional sleeves. These consisted of 100 to 400 gunmen and a handful of pikemen and halberdiers each. Over time, the overall number of pikemen and shot increased at the cost of other melee fighters. These smaller and more flexible squares allowed and asked for more elaborate forms of tactical deployment. An army was no longer simply organized in vanguard, main body, and rear guard, but in a checkered pattern, the so-called Spanish brigade. A simple brigade consisted of 4 tercios. A double brigade consisted of either 7 or 8. The fragmentation of the army meant that the battle wasn't lost if one unit broke or was exhausted. For around 100 years,
that is so smart. Again, like, it's just so cool to see this evolution of this weapon and just how it kept evolving with history. And yeah, the Spanish for a while dominated the world, but again, like, that's the thing. Eventually, if you own something powerful in warfare, like a type of formation or a type of weapon, eventually here's what usually happens. Either people copy you and start using what you do, so you no longer have a monopoly. Kind of think of Napoleon and the core system. For a while, Napoleon utilized the core system, and he was the only one using it, but as time went on, everyone started using the core system. He no longer had a monopoly on that. And eventually people will adopt what you're doing, and eventually someone will find something even better, an improvement upon it, or something entirely new that's even better. That's the thing with war, it's always evolving. No one ever has a complete monopoly on a formation or weapon forever. And eventually something new and better will come along, and it just keeps going. War really is just a never-ending arms race, in a sense. So, yeah. Just like, how can humanity keep topping itself in deadliness,
The Tercio dominated the battlefields of Europe. Even beyond that, it remained a force to be reckoned with. But already, in the late 16th century, a new challenger entered the stage. The Tercio met its new challenger on the infamous fields of Flanders. There, the Spanish faced the reformed army of the United Provinces of the Netherlands, who had risen to fight for independence from their Spanish overlord, who wanted to impose Catholicism on them. In the Battle of Newport in 1600, the Dutch and their allies, among them, to pick up on what we said earlier, some Scottish and Swiss regiments, awaited the Spanish in a strong position on the top of a stretch of dunes. The Spanish advanced towards them, and after a long struggle they made it to the top of the dunes, where they routed the defending English regiments stationed there. But then the tide turned, and a series of counterattacks and cavalry charges finally made the Spanish infantry lines crumble. Soon they were disordered and fled the field. This Dutch victory was owed at least in part to the reforms Maurice of Nassau and his cousin were implementing in the Dutch army. The goal of these reforms was to be able to cope with the Spanish tercios. In search for a more flexible tactic, these military reformers were inspired by the Roman manipular tactic. They hoped to reproduce what the Romans had achieved against the Greek phalanx nearly 2,000 years ago, defeating a massed formation by making their own formation more agile. They deployed their men in so-called battalions, each divided in 5 blocks of pikemen forming the center and 3 blocks of shot on either side. This way they had smaller, more flexible compartments, each consisting of 1 arm only. Additionally, they exploited the defensive potential of shot units. This way, the pikemen's only task was to protect the shot. The depth of the formation could be reduced in favor of a widened front, which in turn allowed to improve firepower. The pikemen formed a wall, behind which both cavalry and shot could seek cover. There's a German saying of the time that goes, quote, "In battle array, the most reliable help one can seek besides God are the Doppelsöldner, i.e. the heavily armed pikemen." As an additional innovation, the Dutch musketeers adapted and refined the so-called countermarch. In the Dutch variation of the countermarch, the first line fired, then went back to the rear of the formation to reload, while the second row was stepping forward and shot. With a depth of 10 men, the first row had reloaded by the time they were at the front again. This way, a Dutch formation could shoot constantly. In order for this formation to be effective, 2 conditions had to be met. Firstly, there had to be professional commanders, and secondly, regular drill. Every move was to be right, even under the pressure of battle. Nevertheless, battles were not too common. Because of the high stakes of losing a field battle and the high losses firearms brought along, the Dutch avoided battle whenever they could, and instead specialized in sieges.
That is so cool. I did not know about the Dutch. I've never heard about that arms area, so that's just super cool to learn about. And like I said, I know a bit about the Swedish. We covered them when we were learning about, the Great Northern War. So, yeah, it'll be cool to have my memory refreshed.
Just after 1600, the Dutch military reforms were brought to Sweden by one of the original reformers, John VII of Nassau-Siegen. There, it was further developed by the famous Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus. He further increased the number of shot contingents in his army and had his men drill so much that they were soon able to put up continuous fire even if they stood only 6 ranks deep. The new formation, the Swedish Brigade, was arguably a blend of the Dutch battalion and the tercio, which neatly combined the advantages of both. In this new Swedish formation, the function of the pikemen was to defend the musketeers, and, if necessary, slowly advance together with the musketeers and fight other formations in melee. However, it's controversial how effective pikemen really were whilst on the offensive. The famous German writer Hans Jakob Christoffel von Grimmelshausen commented on the pikemen of his time ironically, quote, "And I think he who kills a pikeman, whom he could have spared, murders an innocent man. I have seen many harsh events in my days, but rarely have I seen a pikeman killing anyone." End quote. The Swedish army
That's hilarious.
demonstrated that it had successfully refined pike and shot warfare in several battles, most prominently at Breitenfeld in 1631 and Lützen in 1632. The systems of the Dutch and Swedes foreshadowed the more linear formations of the 18th century, in which the pike was replaced with bayonets. The bayonet replaced the pike's defensive function on the battlefield. With that, the pike and shot age ended, and therefore this video. Thank you for watching,
And there's the end of the pikes. GG. My favorite weapon. It was nice having you when we did, but overall this was just a great video. And I'm gonna end it right here. I feel like I've said everything I need to say. I really loved this. Informative, and I hope to watch more of SandRhoman in the future. Until then, bye everyone.